Okay, those of you who've read through your materials in the folder may have noticed, or even on the website, may have noticed that this is the part one of a two-part symposium. We thought after today we may have just inspired you to think more about youth development principles and practices. And I would guess that even though the next panel and the last speaker we will try to give you some concrete ideas about how one actually does this, there'll probably be questions left and practical things we still need to go over. So that's what the second part of the symposium is for, and you're all invited to come back to that. It will be April 14th, and we are doing that in partnership with the Youth Development Institute, which is based here in New York. And I'm going to ask Sandra Escamilla from YDI to come up and tell us a little bit about part two. You have to get close to it.
I have to get close, okay. I'm really excited to be here. I have a range of emotions that I'm still feeling from the dialogue that was happening, that we were just having, and mostly I'm feeling really like this is a special moment that we're beginning to enter this conversation to really think about young people and what are the best ways in which we can really begin to serve them and meet their needs. And so I think about that in relationship to my own work as a practitioner working with vulnerable youth, but also as the executive director of the Youth Development Institute, whose mission is really to promote positive youth development. And we do that in three different ways. The first way is we help build the capacity of organizations that work directly with young people. We also look at some of the gaps in the field, and we create models that really address the needs of young adults. And then we also inform policy and support policy that really enables young people to thrive. And so our symposium on the 14th is really going to be about looking at a framework that we've developed that was really, that comes from a range of research that we've culled over the last few decades, and we've distilled to really three different elements, really looking at youth development in relationship to young people and their connections, looking at youth development in terms of preparing young people, as well as youth leadership. And so we're going to briefly present it, and we're going to really talk a little bit about how we move from these theories to practice and really make a difference at the point of service. And I think in the flyer it says youth development is an art, and we really do believe that it's an intentional act, and that we really want to present to you how we've supported practitioners to move from these theories of practices by creating a culture that really cultivates positive youth development, by really helping practitioners build the competencies they need to really make a difference at the point of services, and how to really build the infrastructure that really sustains youth development. And so we're going to also invite you to engage in some dilemmas of practice, right? So that it's going to be highly interactive. We're going to tell you some of the things that we've struggled with in terms of practice, in terms of policy. And then we're going to tell you what we've learned, right? So lessons from the field. And a real highlight is that there's going to be a panel of practitioners that are going to share with you the concrete strategies that they've implemented to really make a difference in the lives of young people, specifically young people who have been court involved. And those agencies include CASES, Fortune, Eastside House, and the Bronx Youth Center. And then another highlight is the commissioner of the Department of Probation, Ana Bermudez, is going to be really speaking to youth development within the context of DOP. So I hope you can make it, and it's a nice kind of complement to today's conversation. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Ed Mulvey from the University of Pittsburgh. Is it the Department of Psychiatry, School of Psychiatry, Department? And Ed is trained as a psychologist at the University of Virginia, but has been involved in some of the most impactful and visible studies about adolescent offending over the last 20 years or so. And as I said, I got to know, well, actually I've known Ed for about 20 years, I think, when I lived in Pittsburgh. And we spent a lot of time together during that National Research Council panel I told you about. And I grew to really respect Ed, not only for his grasp of the scholarly intellectual framework behind all these ideas, but his understanding and appreciation of some of the practical challenges to making these things real for system-involved young people. So with that, I will introduce Ed Mulvey.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to the sponsors and the Pinkerton Foundation for the opportunity to be here today. I really do appreciate being here, and I mentioned to Jeff, I'm going to give a talk I haven't given before, but so we'll see what happens. I'm hoping it works out kind of okay, all right? And it is to address really this idea of changing the gap between science and practice in this area, and having to do with some of these issues we started to bring up and talk about, well, what does all this developmental stuff mean in the sense of where the system is going? And I think there's a couple of movements that we've seen happening that really make us believe that development is being accepted and matters in this area of juvenile justice. And BJ just did a great job of going over a lot of the science, the neuroscience. This has been a pretty big watershed movement in terms of like basic science people. They see this as really mattering. Paired with that is this whole bit on behavioral science. You know, she had talked some about some of the stuff that Steinberg and his colleagues have done about impulse control. So this stuff has come together, and it's really affected the Supreme Court decisions. And as we mentioned, while it's not redoing the system, it's kind of redoing the ethos or the way we think about it. And there have been a whole series of decisions that have cited this literature and talked about the need for development. And that's translated into a lot of changes in state statutes. Has been probably the most visible thing, and we see that around age boundaries, you know, what constitutes when somebody's a juvenile and when somebody's an adult, and the use of institutional care, as was mentioned earlier. These things are all kind of happening at the same time, and it is making for what we've talked about as kind of a sea change in this area. It really is kind of infusing this idea of development, and kids are kids first and they're offenders later, as the kind of figure and ground shift that's going on in this area. And I think that's all summed up really in this comment from Justice Kagan in the Miller majority opinion, where she said incorrigibility is inconsistent with youth. You know, where we used to just say, well, this kid is a bad kid, or this kid is an ex-kid, or this one goes in this box, or this one goes in that box. They're basically saying the idea of somebody being incorrigible and capable of change doesn't make sense with youth anymore. So I think this isn't, juvenile justice is like always in this problem with fads and findings. You know, we're big on fads. We always have a new fad. We're less about what is a real finding. I think we're moving into an era where we have a little more findings, and I don't think this is quite a fad about what's going on in the field. Now, I'll mention this National Academy of Sciences report that Jeff had already alluded to, and I'm going to mention it because I think they were charged with a lot of what we're trying to figure out here today, and that is looking at all this research. Those of you who do research, look at this stuff. Is it really valid? And if so, what does it kind of say about ways to think about the juvenile justice system or reorient it? And that NAS report had a couple or several major conclusions, and I'll just list them here. But the first thing is the one that I think that BJ emphasized and is probably the most important, and that is that adolescents, we now know that adolescents respond to the opportunities that are given to them, that their brains are very plastic, their behavioral patterns are more plastic, they learn by their experience, that it isn't nature-nurture, it's that interaction of an individual's capacities and what they're exposed to and how they learn things. And that has a big implication for juvenile justice, because for a lot of kids, that's the context. That's where they're going to learn or aren't going to learn, and they spend a lot of time in and out of that system, and they spend a lot of time either getting an opportunity or not getting an opportunity. And it was almost like a light bulb of like, oh, well, if all that's true, juvenile justice better think about what are we doing in terms of a context for these kids when we have them under our control or under our influence, or we intervene with them in some way. So as a result of kind of thinking that way, you can read these, they're fairly straightforward. The one that I think is important about accountability is if you're held accountable and you're accepting responsibility in a fair process, it promotes moral development and legal socialization, okay? That's kind of normal development. That's what kids do, right? Now, the problem is if you're being held responsible in what you would consider an unfair or unreasonable one, it reinforces disaffectation and antisocial behavior. So this whole idea of how you're held accountable, and the juvenile justice system is largely in the business of holding kids accountable, how you're held accountable and how perceived fairness plays into that is important from a developmental perspective. The other thing is that punitive policies and programs don't further pro-social development, or reduce recidivism. And I think that comes from us just looking over a lot of the literature, and there's tons of ways to do this, and there's a whole chapter in there on preventing reoffending and how that's done and what seems to work. Short-term stays in harsh environments don't do anything. Longer-term stays, harsh environments don't help. You know, I mean, there's just a lot of literature out there now that shows that whipping a kid into shape is not the way to go. I mean, it just doesn't work, okay? The other thing was there was no convincing evidence that confinement of juveniles beyond a minimum amount required to provide intense services reduces the likelihood of subsequent offending. The length of stay really doesn't get you much in terms of reduced rearrest. I should also mention that one of the studies we've been involved in over the years is we've followed 1,354 felony-level offending kids in the system. Half of them are from Philadelphia, half of them are from Phoenix. And we pick them up at court disposition, and we follow them into their mid-20s to try to see how they stop. You know, we call pathways to desistance, how you stop all this stuff. And we have a whole series of results from that. I'm not going to present all those data here today, but some points I'm going to make reference to some of the findings we have from there. And this is one that came out rather strongly. It was the first time we were able to kind of do a real strict test of keeping similar kids longer in institutions, and you just don't see a reduction in rearrest rates. And the panel has other data as well that reinforces that. And the last one was the other point that was brought up and is endemic to the justice system, and that's the racial disparities impede efforts to provide equitable services and to contribute to those perceptions of fairness, right? And so it's just throughout the system. You can't escape it. It's a reality. So what are we going to do about that? These were just some of the conclusions that are listed, all right? What that led the panel to, and I mention this because we're going to reorient to these points a little bit as we go through, is that there are really three goals for the juvenile justice system. First one would be promoting accountability, okay? Not punishing kids, promoting accountability. And there's a shade and a very important shade of difference between those two, right? So promoting accountability is a process that kids have to go through, and we want to foster that process. The second one is ensuring fairness. That in fairness in the system, fairness is that mediating thing in the middle, you know, that lets those opportunities be interpreted one way or the other. And the last one is a very real reality, and that's preventing reoffending, okay? It doesn't do the kid any good, it doesn't do the community good, it doesn't do victims any good if kids keep going and doing the same things again and again. So somehow, something's got to be done to try to reduce that threat of reoffending. That's where that panel ended up, all right? That those are probably the three goals. So I think there's some general shifts in policy that we've seen over the years that align with this. First of all, I think that this is a statement, and I think there are others, that public safety has become like an explicit concern and not just kind of buried in the system. Like, oh, if we make a connection with kids and they do better, they'll stop offending and the world will be a safer place. It's much more, okay, what are we going to do about public safety? We have to have some answer to the idea of how the juvenile justice system can address the issue of public safety, all right? The second one is risk management in place of prediction. And I think BJ had mentioned before, it's really hard to figure out which path a kid's going to go on when you see them at 14 or 15 to figure out where they're going to be at 27 or 28. So the system has kind of moved from deciding who the bad apples are to kids are at risk by being adolescents, and kids are at risk by being in certain neighborhoods, and they're at risk by associating with other people. They're at risk for a lot of other things. How do we manage that risk? How do we do short-term goal setting? How do we introduce things to them that they can do reasonably without trying to pick the bad ones out and treat them differently, all right? This is a risk management problem. This isn't a prediction problem, okay? The other thing is there are potential developmental costs to being involved in juvenile justice, and this is pretty well recognized. The kids who go further into the system, you know, get exposed to a lot of things, and it's not a benign involvement. So what are the developmental costs, and how do we mitigate against those for kids who do get involved in the juvenile justice system? And the last one is it's part of a community network of agencies. The juvenile justice system doesn't sit by itself. We heard today about the relationship with education. We have a whole lot of other systems out there. The juvenile justice system is starting to say, well, we just do this, we're out here, we're all on our own. I don't think so. You're part of a whole lot of other things that affect kids' lives. And that's been a recognition. And I think these broad shifts in policy have taken place in a lot of areas, and they reflect kind of the belief that maybe the juvenile justice system can do business in a little different way, all right? Now, I'm going to use this as an orientation point. I'm going to walk through it. And this is a diagram that shows up in a ton of textbooks and other places. Go from the left to the right and just think about it pretty simplistically. It's from when a kid comes into the juvenile justice system and how they might get out. And it goes from the left of kind of arrest or referral through the different types of hearings in those boxes along the middle. And they can go in and out of detention at the bottom. Okay, they can move back and forth from detention settings. And there, you notice there are some areas where they're out. They just, they leave the system at some point. The top bar up there is the adult criminal justice system. Kids can go back and forth from the adult criminal justice system to the juvenile system, all right? And down at the end is a disposition. When the court finally decides what they're going to do, they can send them to probation, they can place them, they can put them on aftercare, they can recycle. Kids can recycle in that system as well, where you go into placement, you get out, you violate, you come back, okay? So this is kind of a simplistic view of how you move through the justice system, and it's kind of an overview diagram. And I just want to use it as a way to say, so, okay, let's think about development. Let's think about some of these broad shifts in policy. How would they work? How would we make them work in different parts of the system? And I'm just going to start over here at the left. We're going to do one thing on the left. That's close the front door. And this is a phrase that Jeff Butts has given to me from time to time. He says, first thing you got to do is close the front door. I mean, quit letting that many kids in. And that takes in all of these processes here on the left, where you think about arrest. So what would that mean to kind of close the front door? How would we do that? Because we think there's a developmental cost to be paid. And we know there's a disproportionate developmental cost to be paid. Therefore, don't get as many kids in there. If we can avoid getting them in, why make them pay the cost, right? So first of all, we got to somehow reduce school referrals, school suspensions. Big study in Texas. If you haven't seen it, you should look at it, about the disproportionate minority involvement in school suspensions and the heavy relationship between school suspensions and involvement in the juvenile justice system. And the school outside of law enforcement is the second, in just about all locales, is the second largest feeder of kids into this system. So you've either got to get the schools to change systems about referral to juvenile justice, or you got to change police practice to be less confrontational and less likely to take kids to detention. Okay, that'll have an effect on closing the front door. The other thing that's become rather commonplace in most places now is screen out low-risk offenders, and you're going to divert them at detention and at intake. And this is the use of risk-need instruments, structured risk-need instruments, where a kid comes up to be admitted to a detention center, and if they really don't pose a high risk, they don't have priors, they got a lot of positive things in their lives, they won't take them into detention. You've got to meet a certain criteria. It's an involved process to put structured risk needs into effect. A whole lot of locales have done it. It has issues about whether or not it, in most cases, reduces the disproportionate minority confinement at the front end, but not all the time. And this has also been pointed out by my colleague Jeff, is that if you keep building risk needs instruments based on rearrest and you keep rearresting people disproportionately, your risk need instruments simply indicate what the system does already. So there's kind of a circular thing here where this whole race and disproportionality thing isn't solved by risk need assessments. There's a lot of work to be done in that area. But this is a very reasonable approach. It's made great headway in the last so many years to reduce detention populations, largely through Casey's Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative. I think that's it, JDAI, right. And the other thing is then referral to other community providers. And this is a big thing for mentally ill kids coming into the juvenile justice system. So we want to close the front door. How are we going to close the front door? These are the ways that are usually done with it. So, let me see if I can find my, okay. So what are the issues with doing this? Let's say we agree with this developmental stuff. We want to close the front door. What's the problems? And I'd argue we always know more about what we want to get rid of than what we think should be in place. Okay, and I think that's the box we're in right now. We kind of know we don't want to do this, but we're not, and we believe that somehow if we just close the front door, life will go on, kids will develop, the world will be good. I don't think that's the case. I think less institutional care isn't a singular end goal, and the other side of that coin is effective alternative treatment in the community. And positive outcomes are not inevitable. part of the problem is we lure ourselves into thinking, well, if we just don't get these kids in the system, they'll all do okay. They won't all do okay. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. Are there viable community alternatives? I keep saying we made this mistake a couple of times. I'm in a department of psychiatry, so I do a lot of stuff with mentally ill individuals. We did this with the mentally ill already. We closed institutions. We didn't have any community-based alternatives. We thought, oh, they'll all be fine. They'll all return to a loving family and everything will be good. That really didn't happen, okay? We have them now in jails, mostly, jails and prisons, all right? So we're going to do the same thing here in juvenile justice unless we figure out where we're going to instead of where we want to get away from. And I think that's one of the key points I want to get to here. The second thing is limiting exposure to adolescents. Wait a minute, sorry. The second thing is getting the money to move from institutional care to community-based service budgets. Not only do we have to have a model for what these should be, but the other prong of this is just getting the money out of there. You can reduce institutional care down a certain level. That doesn't necessarily translate into dollar for dollar stuff to community alternatives. In fact, you've got to close a whole institution to get anything, and that's a big political problem. And where does that money anyway go? I can tell you in the state of Pennsylvania, it usually goes into the general fund. It doesn't go to community-based alternatives. So the reality of shifting the money is as critical as knowing shifting the money to what. We got to have a what, but we also got to get some money moved to get to that what. But it's going to be hard until we figure out exactly what the what is. Okay? The second one is this transfer up. So we're talking about closing the front door. The second way is don't get kids into the adult criminal justice system for all the reasons we talked about, the exposure to the exposure to adult criminals and so on. So this translates into a couple of things. The discretion about transfer to the judiciary rather than the prosecuting attorney. Most states now have statutes that, at age 15 and charged with attempted murder, you will go to the adult system. In some states, at age 15, charged with attempted murder, you go to the adult system, and there's no chance of you coming back. Arizona, for instance, has you transfer up. There's no transfer back. In Pennsylvania, you can transfer up and have a hearing and come back to the juvenile system, all right? And some places have juvenile system only responsible for kids up to age 18, or others have up to 21, even though, you came in at 17, you're still under their jurisdiction at 19. So these statutes are all over the place. But one of the things that people consistently want to do is examine those statutes, get them out of there, and let's get some individualization back into these decisions and quit what the reality is you move all the discretion from the juvenile court judge or an adult court judge to the prosecuting attorney. Because the prosecuting attorney now is in a position, well, I'll charge you with this unless something else happens. And that's not necessarily the place where I think you want discretion about where we're going to have kids land for a long time in the justice system. Although many of my friends and prosecuting attorneys say that's exactly where you want it to land, but that's a discussion we've had on many an occasion. And the other thing is this, limiting exposure to adolescent criminals and the damaging effects of adult institutional experiences, right? Okay. Now, what's the issues with doing that? What's the issues with getting less of the kids moved up to the adult system? And I'd argue this is finding common policy ground. This is an interesting problem in the system right now. We got these alliances that really kind of can't come together to find the mid-ground on things. And I'm reflecting some of my experiences in Pennsylvania, but I believe they're pretty indicative of a lot of different states. And that is that there's a legislative inertia. I've yet have to find a legislator who wants to go soft on crime. Okay, I don't know where they are, but I'm not sure they're out there. The other one is there's a relationship between district attorneys and victim advocates, okay, to talk about retribution and the need to keep minimum mandatory sentences, and that's a very tough political set of allies. And the last one is the advocacy communities don't seem to want to accept some mid-ground on transfer. Transfer is good or bad. It's bad. Therefore, we shouldn't do it. Odds are, this is my opinion, I don't think we're going to get rid of transfer. It's been with the juvenile court since the court was founded. But the advocacy community has to be willing to accept some mid-ground, and they've got to drive some other people to it. Right now, they just can't find that common policy mid-ground. And these statutes are changing very, very slowly. And then how do you make up for lost time in development? I don't think we got an answer to that one. When you've lost this period, I don't know we have any intervention or something that says, okay, what you didn't get, let's try to recreate it or do it or fill that gap. I don't know that that's around. And a lack of attention to the parole decision making process. A lot of the kids that move up to the adult system end up getting adult sentences. We never look at the back end. If you want to reduce the amount of exposure that these kids have, shorten their sentences at the front end and the back end. And the Supreme Court in Miller pointed to this and basically said the other way that you can do it is get a meaningful review at the time of parole instead of a meaningful review at the time of sentencing. So that's something we haven't even touched. We haven't even thought about how to reduce exposure by thinking of a differential parole process for kids who get transferred up as adolescents. Okay. So now let's go to those hearings, that section in the middle there, all right? Now this one is one where you think of like kids and families coming into the court and going through the process. How could that be more developmentally sensitive? And we want some procedural justice in the court hearings, some more to foster a sense of fairness. You know, we go back to that idea that fairness is really essential. And then you want to match the inconsistencies, the interventions, and the risk level of the adolescent, the intensiveness of the interventions. And you want some sort of family engagement. All of those things would be kind of in line with what we think about as a developmental perspective. So why are we having some problems doing that? One is every juvenile court person I talk to is caseloads in time. You know, I mean, I just got a lot of stuff to do. We got a lot of cases coming through here. We can't be taking 20 minutes with every case to discuss, you know, whether they're feeling like they have adequate opportunities in their life. You know, I mean, it's just not our job. That's not what we do, okay? The second thing, and I would argue, is judicial education and socialization. I think if you look at judges or lawyers, and they're oftentimes either totally dedicated to the juvenile court system, sometimes moving through the juvenile court system, and to other things. And I think getting judges adequately educated, given their turnover and given their orientation, is a real tough thing. And I don't think we've got judges yet thinking developmentally as much. In fact, I gave a presentation to the one major metropolitan area judges, and the judge raised his hand. He says, "This is all real interesting. It has nothing to do with what I do every day." And I said, "Okay." So, you know, so I just think in general, it's an area we haven't focused a lot on. The other thing is data management and quality. We have little about adolescents once they're placed or once they're out on probation, or the types of services they're actually getting. The stuff just doesn't come back to the court that they could actually do something about maybe providing more opportunities for these adolescents. Let me go to the back end then. Placement after post-disposition, all right? Now at this end, we want to make, you know, public safety, not perceived need, the major consideration for institutional care. In other words, sort of having a bar that's saying, unless this is a public safety issue, we really don't want to have a kid go to institutional care. If it qualifies as sort of the public safety bar, then let's talk about where and how and why. But until it gets over that public safety bar, just because this kid has a lot of problems, I don't think it's really worth sending them to an institution for an extended time period. And places have taken that approach. This is all, you know, the standard idea of what we want to see in a more developmental approach and less exposure is less institutions, fewer dispositions, shorter stays, right place for the right adolescents, closer to home, right? These are all the things that are out there, and I think these are all goals that are in line with an idea of continuing to give kids opportunities to interact. We want more evidence-based institutional care and improved institutional environments, right? Instead of just sending kids to institutions and hoping nothing horrible happens to them, we want to send them to institutions and hope something really good happens to them, that there's a reason to believe that what somebody's doing makes sense. The other one is more informed reviews of placement process and making re-entry a priority. Everybody you talk to, the buzzword is, you know, re-entry begins at day one of the kid's placement in an institution. How we do that is still a little murky out here, all right? But these are all things that you would say are all developmentally reasonable, right? Now, some of the issues here, I think, have to do with the availability and quality of community alternatives, and this was mentioned before, for these adolescents. There are a lot of programs in the community. I can tell you from following the service histories of serious offending kids in 2 cities over this time, the level of community-based services that deep-end serious offending kids get is very low. I mean, we followed kids, and one thing that we calculated just struck me. We have a diagnostic interview up front of substance abuse, diagnosable substance abuse problems, which is about 40% of the kids who are at the deeper end of the system. We follow those kids over 7 years, get services they received in the community. 30% of those kids with diagnosable substance use disorders in the juvenile justice system that we had in our sample ever had any one-time service at all in the community over 7 years during the follow-up period. We have services, whether these kids are getting to those services and whether the right services are getting to these kids is really still a big problem, because we can talk about developmentally appropriate services is who are the kids who are in a lot of these services. The second one is some lack of a system for quality improvement of institutions. Remember I said we want institutions to be better, the environment to be better. There's little systematic way of institutions to assess their service delivery and how well they're doing. The other one is getting information back to the court about placement or community progress. I had mentioned this before, and that is simply, oftentimes the court doesn't get back, if I sent a kid to a facility because they have a substance use problem, did they get services for the substance use problem? Okay? It's rather simple, but if you've sat in on review hearings of disposition placements, it's largely, how's the adjustment going? How are you doing? Okay, that's pretty good. Tell me what you did good. You know, and it's a very quick sort of thing. It's little systematic about what services are actually provided. And this may be different in a lot of places. The other one is family engagement and reentry. We talk about reentry. A lot of these kids are going back to their families, yet the family engagement is still a really murky concept in this area. We want to talk about development. We want to talk about appropriate developmental activities. The connection with your parents continues in late adolescence, and in many cases gets even more intense around instrumental support and other types of emotional support. So getting the family engaged is another big issue that we have here. So I've run through the system from one end to the other. I just want to end with some broad challenges. What's this kind of translate into? One is one that was implied in BJ's presentation, and it's a real challenge for the field of providers, but also a scientific challenge is, can we speed up that maturity anyway? You know, can we help kids to think a little more, with a little more forethought and maybe a little less impulsivity? And how do we do that effectively? And will that matter for offending? All right. The other thing is a development of some credible methods for enforcing accountability. Accountability has become the new thing that we like to think we want to do, and I agree with this 100%. The question is, how do we get methods for enforcing accountability? What are those mechanisms? We've got things like restorative justice. We have some other mechanisms that mesh well with the juvenile court process, but do we have them in a usable system? Do we have them in any kind of package that we can use them and show that they have a real effect? The other one is, I'll put in here, and because we're in the juvenile justice system, I put up here capitalizing on deterrence. I do not think that a developmental approach says that an adolescent getting a punishment of some sort is bad, horrible, never do. I agree that you want to help them be rewarded at all opportunities. But there are data out there that say kids do respond somewhat to deterrence. The important thing is getting the system to understand is kids respond to the certainty of deterrence, not the severity of deterrence, okay? All of the power of deterrence, all of the power of an arrest, all of the power of being detected, all of the power of doing community service, all the power of anything that comes about from violating a rule comes from the idea that somebody's going to find out and it's going to have an impact. It doesn't come from the fact that I'm going to get 8 months instead of another type of accountability mechanism. So I think that I don't think it does us any good to just say deterrence doesn't exist. I think deterrence does exist, but how we use it effectively and think about integrating it into development would make a lot of sense. The other thing I just put up here is data, data, data. I've been so frustrated with looking at juvenile justice system information systems and data that are out there. that until we can actually take seriously the idea that information has to be shared back to courts or to institutions or back and forth from people, this is going to be really hard to solve, because a lot of it rests on looking at the kid as a whole, not looking at the kid as the act they did. So it looks at the actor, and until you can get a picture of what's happening in that kid's lives and share that with somebody else who's affecting that kid's life, we're just going to keep doing, haphazard sorts of things with kids. And I think this is a real problem. The analogy I always make is I grew up in my father was in the pizza business, so we have a small pizza business, and he went into the baking business years ago. So we started baking. We sell partially baked pizza shells, right, to distributors, like Cisco and other places that do restaurants and things. And I can tell you right now what the percentage of scrap is on that production line. This is a small business. We're talking 17 people or something. But we know how much scrap comes out of there. We know what everybody we sell to's profile of what they buy is. We know what their pricing is. We know how much it costs to put the ingredients in. You can't go to the juvenile justice system and get that information. We don't even know how many people are scrap in our system and what we do with them, And if I were running a business the way this place runs, I'd be out of business, all right? And it's astounding. That's my pitch on data. I go on about this because I use it anyway. The other thing is not confusing EBP's, evidence-based practices, with system improvement. The thing that's become very now is like, we're going to do a developmentally evidence-based practice. Maybe, maybe not, okay? That isn't necessarily system and service improvement. And I think it's just much more involved. And I'll just put that up there for people who live in this world to understand that demonstrating a process of effective intervention is a little different than adopting an EBP. And I think that we have to be very clear about that EBPs aren't going to solve everything. We're not going to have the right developmental intervention for the right kid at the right time. If we ever do that, I'd be amazed, all right? So I think we have to think about service improvement more broadly than just saying, oh, well, we have EBPs now, don't worry about it. And if you look at this stuff, about 10 to 15% of the kids in juvenile justice ever get an evidence-based program. So the idea that it's going to just take over the field and be given to every kid and, we kind of got this solved, now it's just a matter of getting it out and marketing it and adopting it, I don't see that happening. Accepting, defining, and using family engagement. And I mention this because at each end, at the front end, in the middle in the process, and at the back end, we really aren't quite sure what to do about families. We're not sure whether to engage them. We're not sure whether to get the kid to stay away from them. They are a major developmental arena for a child. And unless we start thinking about this seriously in juvenile justice and getting it defined and figuring out what it means, I think we're missing a major developmental opportunity. We want to talk development. Let's talk where the kid actually grows up and spends a whole lot of his or her time. And the last thing is developing quality services in the community. I'll go back to this. This is where I started. Who's responsible for this? How does it get done? And how does it get funded? And I think that's the major issues. Those big, broad things, I believe, are kind of what's challenging us. I'm a full advocate of this whole developmental approach. The issue is, how do we get it done in here? And this is kind of just a look at the general policy issues that seem to arise when we want to take it seriously. If we want to take it seriously, if we want to have it be another fad, we can have it be another fad. If we want it to have it be a set of findings that are really going to change the way we do juvenile justice, I think we've got to address some of these issues. And these are the real challenges ahead for us in doing that, I think. Thank you.
Appreciate a lot what you have to say. And I think the part that really got to me was the idea that we need to create credible methods for enforcing accountability. But another part of that was that we recognize that our youth don't respond well to unfair methods. But I think we all agree, or we can agree, that with the front door issues that we discussed, that the police, maybe the school system, the the child welfare system, and other issues that they encounter kind of have, by the time they get to us, bred this sense of distrust and lack of hope that they will get fair treatment. So our challenge as providers has been to rebuild that relationship, just as people who they perceive who have power that they can trust and that aren't going to unfairly treat them. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about, that idea that we have to rebuild that, and that so much is lost before they even arrive to a provider.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you 100%. I think that, and I always kind of go back to some data. When we had these kids from Philadelphia and Phoenix and we were following them, we have a whole set of measures on procedural justice and legitimacy of the law and fairness and this sort of stuff. And what struck us was we figured, well, over the course of us following them, some kids are going to get a big increase and seeing the system is more fair, and some are going to get a drop off. And we basically found 4 levels, and they all kind of pretty much stayed the same over time, all right? So I agree with you that these are set earlier, and these are set when the kid's like 9, 10, 11 years old, and in interactions with school officials, interaction with security, mall officers, or whatever, and I think you do have to rebuild it, and it's got to be rebuilt. It's not something that we're just going to turn on and off. I think it's already entrenched by the time most of the kids get to the deep end, anyway, of the juvenile justice system. Maybe not as much the front end, but definitely by the time you're back into placing kids at disposition, they're pretty set on that stuff.
I was going to say, you mentioned about with closing the front door that we have to look at reducing school suspensions. But I think one of the issues that's not brought up a lot is that a lot of the kids are staying within the system but are being funneled into District 75 schools, and mostly because of behavioral issues. So I feel like even though we want to concentrate on looking at suspensions, that a major issue that's happening is that the kids are just being diagnosed improperly. So even if we were to cut suspensions out completely, what do we do about the fact that half our kids are in the wrong schools themselves?
Yeah, I don't. I have no idea how the school system works in that regard. And I just know in general, this is the continuing issue of educational officials having trouble figuring out when a case comes to juvenile justice and when juvenile justice says they're not getting an appropriate case. I know that goes back and forth a lot. I know that in some cases they've changed regulations about when kids can go in and out of schools. We had a system in Pennsylvania where if you came out of the juvenile justice system, you had to go back to, I'm not sure what the types of schools you're talking about. We called them AIU sorts of or IU placements, intermediate unit placements, where they were special schools for all the kids who gotten kicked out of other schools. And then we took the kids who were trying to reintegrate back in the community, and we put them in the schools with all the other kids who were going the other way on the juvenile justice system. They could meet each other, I guess, as some were coming in and some were going out. And we changed that, that process. But for things like gun possession, schools had the total option to not take kids back with gun possession.
I'm just saying the only reason I brought that up is because a lot of times the special education schools happen to be one of the ways that they're being funneled back into the system. You have kids who are in classes where they're not getting the kind of information that is stimulating because they're working at a lower level than where they're at. So those kids disengage, drop out, and a lot of times end up on the streets or reincarcerated or incarcerated for the first time. So I'm just mentioning it as something to add to the conversation that I don't think it's just about the suspensions themselves. I think it has to be about where are the kids going if they're not suspending them.
Sure. No, I don't mean to, but when we talk about this development idea, and we take seriously the idea that you have to build sort of context around a kid to give them good opportunities. There's obviously the school, there's the families, there's it's not anybody's going to solve this. It's not like if they would just change their practices and they did a better job, all these kids would do better. Boy, if it were that easy, we probably would have figured it out by now, And I think it's all of those things together.
Yeah.
I agree.
Hi. So thank you for having me here, Jeff. I want to preface this by saying a lot has happened in the 2 months since this was supposed to happen, so I'm actually no longer with the Fortune Society. So if I say anything kind of reckless, I don't want people thinking I'm with Joanne coming after me. I'm not going to preface my question. I'm just going to ask you straightforward. What would promoting accountability versus punishment look like in the current McDonald's case that we've seen in Flatbush, Brooklyn?
Oh, God. What would promote accountability? Well, I guess oh, boy. This is why I'm glad I'm not a juvenile court judge or an administrator. See, I can win academics. I don't have to answer these questions. Nobody asked me those in academics.
Well, you went straight to the court system, so that's what I'm asking. So when we think about this case, or as we are thinking about it, the initial reaction to everything is like, it's an extremely a criminal justice response. And I'm not saying that should not be a response. I'm saying like even in how we sort of, even in the sort of like joke in answering the question, the first thing was like, well, I'm not a judge, or et cetera. So
Right.
that's what I'm kind of asking is like, if we're going to have, if we're rethinking this approach to young folks and positive youth development, what would promoting accountability look like versus just punishment?
I think it would have to be something that the adolescent does affirmatively rather than has done to them and feels like that wasn't fair that you did that to me. So something and it has to be either some sort of restitution or some sort of way of getting out and doing something positive rather than just being punished and figuring, well, I got off light, I got off easy. That's the mindset of being judged by what got done to you rather than what you have to do to make it right is part of the essence of the difference between punishment and accountability, I'd argue. So I think having the kids do something that's active rather than just have something done to them is somewhat in there. I don't know what that means. That's pretty vague, but that's sort of what I'm thinking.
Right.
I had a response to that too. No, you can go ahead.
I want to pick up on that. Whenever I have these conversations, you said a couple things, Ed, that the juvenile justice system is just part of the community-wide collection of agencies and groups we have to deal with young people who are at risk of getting more deeply involved in the justice system. Schools, social services, child welfare, community, parks and rec. There's a lot of different things. And when you say that, Marlon, that we immediately, what should happen to these kids, and Ed makes the joke about courts, that is part, we don't have faith in something that lies just shy of a person in a black robe making a ruling. And whenever I talk about this with people, I have that same vision that it would be nice if when a young person first comes to the attention of their community by engaging in behavior that's unacceptable or dangerous or whatever, could we have a tighter coordination? And you said this, Ed, could we have a tighter coordination between the justice system and all those other allied services to the extent that we could all have faith when we say, well, what this kid really needs is an experience that's pro-social and fun and engaging, and it's something to do after school. And can you do that without someone in the black robe saying, and if you don't do this, we're coming after you? Can you have the community exercise some kind of, if not authority, some kind of encouragement for those activities to be available without resorting to legal authority?
Yeah.
Do you have examples of that where you think it works?
Yeah, I would say that I agree that we're not going to get very far in this McDonald's case, for instance, by purely punishing the person and saying, well, there needs to be some punitive action. They need to perhaps even further criminalize any lack of cooperation with that sanction. And I think that just kind of leads to this idea that we just fall deeper and deeper into certain holes. So some accountability which involves that young person understanding that what they did not only harmed that person immediately, harmed the community. I mean, obviously, we're all, I think we said, in shock because we saw this. Understanding what that person's experiences were. I think we talked a little bit about the idea that you may have, that she may have learned, I don't know who she is, and I almost feel bad that she's discussed to this level and poured over to this level, but what her experiences have been, what has informed her decision making and how she solves conflicts. I think all of that would be helpful to understand. And certainly just, I don't know what engagement she has in her community. Ideally, to answer that question, we would already have such a, I think to use Jeff's phrase, a tightly knit community that we could handle it in a real way. So in the system we have now, I'm not exactly sure. I think there would be some restorative elements, some elements that help her to understand what the impact of her actions has been. But more importantly, moving forward, we have the ability to know that she already has connection to her school, to her church, to her community-based organization, and that they can take her under their wing and say, do you understand all of this? Do you understand what's going on? And why did this happen? And how can we make it better? And it may sound wishy-washy, but I think will have a better impact than punishing her, putting her on probation, sending her to juvenile detention, and labeling her as a violent criminal.
One of the things that I want to say, and just going off of that, is that, Edward, you brought up the idea of needing more funding, how to increase mindfulness, and the idea that we can't just punish the student for what they've done, but also to recognize what's been done to them. So I just want to address those things. One of the things I'm finding is that a lot of the funding for the foundations who are doing the organizations that are doing good work, ATIs, a lot of that funding goes toward collecting data that isn't used to actually improve services. And with that, a lot of the things that they're actually being funded for, they're not being funded for, were you able to help this young person do self-reflection and find resolution? They're being funded for the fact that they had 10 sessions of who knows what. And if the funding isn't going toward that reflection process, there's step one, that's an issue. Then you talk about mindfulness. I think mindfulness is something that we can increase. I think the way to do it is that a lot of us know, a lot of the country is shifting, right? People are looking at juvenile justice more. People are having more information about it. People are talking about it more. We're still not talking to enough of the young people. I find, at least in my experience, especially at Exalt, that when young people come to the program and we inform them about the school to prison pipeline, when we inform them about what's going on in the justice system, when we inform them about the statistics, when we inform their parents, when we inform the people that they interact with, there is a rapid effect that happens. So mindfulness can be increased, I think, when you inform people about what's actually happening to them. So it's not just about evaluating the ways to punish them for what they're doing or to find ways to just reroute them, but to actually look inward and try to evaluate what's the intrinsic motivation that's happening with them. But of course, that is not going to happen because these organizations that are supposed to be helping them are not being funded to look at that part of the situation. So for me, mindfulness, funding, and the actual services that are necessary are all connected.
Yeah, can I mention one of the other things that this brings up is the idea that reduced offending isn't necessarily positive development. You know, they're two very different things. And we try to kind of think, well, you know, if the kid stops doing X, then they must be developing well. And what you're talking about is measuring development rather than and really moving forward rather than just measuring stopping doing whatever behavior is illegal or troublesome or whatever.
Exactly.
And I mean, again, to go back to a lot of the kids we followed, a whole lot of kids stop offending, you know, or stop getting arrested and still do stuff. A whole lot of them start working, living more stable lives, and still do a lot of illegal stuff. Right. And we got kids who, you know, stop doing illegal stuff. You know, all of those boxes of development, good, bad, offending, yes, no. There's kids in all of those boxes. This is not one process is not a mirror of the other. And as long as we keep just saying, well, you know, a lot of them didn't get arrested, therefore the program's a success, we're kind of missing the conceptual boat here.
No, I agree.
What you're trying to do, yeah.
No, I agree.
Yeah, and on the funding issue, I think I mean, I'm always frustrated by funding questions because we had the money to incarcerate youth at an alarming rate. And now that we're not doing that, it would seem like a fairly, maybe almost too logical reallocation of that same cash to, you know, help youth or help communities have more positive developments. So I'm wondering, you know, we hear about justice reinvestment, which is an idea that exactly what I just described. We had a pot of money that we were spending on X, we're saving money on X, can we spend that on Y? But I just don't see it happening. I'm wondering what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd actually turn that over to Jeff probably. You have more information on justice reinvestment, what's happening to money moving places to alternative services?
Can I just jump in, sort of add more stuff for Jeff to answer on that point? Because one of the questions I also had is like, how do we make positive youth justice politically expedient? Because I think what sort of drives the funding, we know part of what drives, a huge part of what drives the funding is whether or not it looks good in somebody's campaign or what have you. So how to do both.
And could I ask one of my colleagues to put the mics into position because we're about to turn to the audience Q&A. Yeah, the resources have to shift. You have to have support for positive alternatives in the community. And I think judges and prosecutors have to believe that whatever alternatives or ATIs are being offered up are actually effective, which brings up the data issue. There's a lot of obstacles that prevent people from having faith in something other than incarceration. Because we know when we put someone in a box, not the boxes you were talking about, but an actual box, that you've got control over the situation. Now you're making everything worse in the long term, but at least you have that control. And I think a lot of times judges and prosecutors are reluctant to believe in the shift because they're not sure those agencies are going to perform, right. which brings up the data issue. Yeah. How do we have, I don't know how we authorize the justice system to get involved with things that we believe would be appropriate in the community in terms of arts and personal expression and physical activities and work support programs and all those things. How do you do that without the inevitable takeover of the justice perspective, where we think we started a program because kids need the experience of expressing themselves, so we create this spoken word program or this music program, and a year later you come back and kids are being sanctioned for not going. They're getting their being reverted back into incarceration because they failed to perform adequately in the music program. How do you stop that?
Well, I think so. The title of this conference is like how to make youth justice compatible with science, and so in my experiences, I think the chasm lies in, and one of the guy from DOE sort of alluded to it in terms of staff training, right? So when we have these concepts now, these concepts may be written into contracts or grants where they may say that you may, start some sort of program around these sort of theories. I think my experience is that the implementation of it and the organizational dedication to the implementation, to the fidelity of that theory is where the chasm lies. So that's when we'll have that situation you mentioned with a young person who may not have completed this program in the way that they felt they should have. This person is now sanctioned for it because it lies in that chasm right there between the theory and the actual implementation and practice of it, and alignment with staff training to actually fully understand, not just in terminology, but fully understand what positive youth development is.
I also think that evaluators need to be connecting with practitioners to develop the tools to actually observe what's happening with the youth that they work with. I think a lot of times there's a disconnect there, and that's why there's such an aversion to data. It's not because we don't want ways to prove that besides recidivism, there are positive things we're doing with the young people we serve. I think it's because the tools that we're being asked to use aren't adequate, and they don't measure things that actually matter. We know that the prison system does not work. Let's just be clear about that. But for some reason, tons of money is funneled into that. I just feel like if we actually were getting assessments and tools to measure things that are actually positively affecting the young people we serve, people would be more interested in using them. And I agree with what you said, Marlon. I also think that training is necessary. I think you can't give somebody a tool and say, use it. You can't same way you can't funnel money into these organizations and say, it's going to be for one thing when you know it's not going to be used for that thing. So I feel like it doesn't matter if we keep giving money to even the organizations who are doing good things if that money is used for a head count and not about the actual improvement of the youth who come through the program.
I just want to mention the thing that maybe this is more marked in institutional care, but it has struck me also about community-based services, is that the court's current practice is to believe that their intervention is going to change an individual's life, that they're largely a people-changing organization, that coming to court is going to teach you a lesson and something's going to happen. I would argue and have argued that in many ways the juvenile court would be better off if they operated like a bankruptcy court. And they basically looked and said, okay, we're going to reorganize this company, and I need to know where that money went and what happened to it. And I need to know from service providers, you said you were going to do something with them. Did you do it or didn't you do it? I mean, while I applaud the efforts of most service providers, a great number of them, very frankly, get the money and don't do exactly what they say they're going to do with it.
That's true.
And I've talked to enough kids who have gone to groups where one person showed up and the group leader showed up, so they went home. All right? And then they go to court at the hearing and it says, yes, I was in group treatment for 8 weeks. Or nobody even asked whether you went 8 weeks or did you go? Yes, I went. You know, I mean, it is so mushy about what providers actually do that I think along with a reorientation to the recognition of the necessity of developmentally appropriate interventions is a reorientation of service providers to being monitored pretty closely about whether they actually see these kids and do things that they say they're going to do or don't do.
And I think that's interesting. I do think that we absolutely should be evaluating to see if the organizations are providing the services they say they will provide, but I think it would be better if we evaluated people who are putting these policies in place, evaluating people who are saying that the money should go where it's going, because the fact that you said, but a kid can show up and someone's not there to lead that activity, yes, that's not a good thing. But I think the major issue is around the fact that there's no checks and balances for people at the top. So there's nobody saying that this money should be funneled to the right place. Right. You know, so I feel like it's really easy to kind of like go out. I'm not saying you're going after the practitioners,
I get it.
but I think it's easy to kind of say, well, you guys aren't really doing your job. I think, it's harder to say, we're not putting the money in the right place anyway. So that's really the bigger issue.
I agree that they're both issues. I don't think one excludes the other. I think they're both legitimate concerns.
But Yolanda, are you
Yeah.
saying that people who work with young people every day know some things that those of us who don't work with young people every day don't know?
Yes, I am saying that. I will say, and Jeff, you know this, I'm coming from the perspective of someone who definitely was a practitioner, but I'm also an evaluator. And I really believe in numbers, I do. But I think if you're not measuring the right things, it doesn't matter.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's, yes, thank you. Questions from the audience? You have to come to the microphone. And remember to introduce yourself first.
Hi, how are you doing? I'm a Pinkerton fellow. My name is Spencer. I also work at Advocates for Children, so all of the school to prison pipeline stuff is where my niche is right now. I think it's important what you guys have said about accountability for individuals and acts, but I want to blatantly ask, what policies can we start to implement to address systematic racism? Because I feel like this is the underlying issue of all of this stuff right now, and that we addressed, but we're not really attacking that issue, which is pretty much the foundation of what's going on with the targeting of Black and Latino men.
I couldn't agree with you any more than I couldn't tell you how much I agree with you. So much of the issues that I believe we see are tied to not only racism, but the misunderstanding of what racism is. Sometimes we do believe that only a person can be racist, so your question about systemic racism is very important to me, and I appreciate that. And also the idea that it's just very polar. Either you're a complete racist or you are a completely non-racist system or person. And that's obviously also not true. So I think the first thing we need to do is admit that it exists, admit that it's there. So, when we talk to police departments and they say, no, we just go where the crime is, we don't follow race, and that's the answer, and any assertion or conversation thereafter turns into a lot of resentment and anger, then we haven't really gotten anywhere. And that's the truth for child welfare systems, for school systems, and everywhere else we go. So the first thing we need to do is have an open dialogue, as cliche as it sounds, where we say, yeah, this happens, this exists, and let's kind of figure out why. And then we talked a little bit, and I won't over-answer this question, but I just really liked it, is that we have to, part of these honest dialogues have to include some training of our decision makers, of our power differentials. So a police officer needs to understand, what implicit biases that they have when making a traffic stop, or when perhaps they feel like their life is in danger. What is informing their feelings of feeling like they're in danger. And when a school teacher is preparing to expel someone from their classroom, why are they more likely to suspend someone who's not of the same race as them, or a black or brown boy? Why is that more likely to happen? And what is going on within them and within their system? So again, without over answering, I think we need to first have that larger dialogue, and then also look at these micro interactions and unpack them and discuss them in a real, authentic way.
I'd like to also add on to that. One of the things that I've mentioned before in other places, when we think about evaluations and evaluators and people and organizations who can afford these certain evaluations to be implemented within their program. So we think about racism, some people think about it individually. I'm happy you brought it in, Hans, in terms of structurally and systematically. So there's no doubt that there's some organizations who are able to receive certain evaluations, and when they're able to get these certain evaluations, you're able to sort of fund your program more, right? Now, there are organizations who don't have that access because they don't have access to capital, physical capital, but also social capital, who tend to be run by folks who are black and brown and whatnot, who come from disproportionate spaces, who don't have access to, as I mentioned, to social capital, so they're not able to get these sort of top university-bound evaluations. They can't afford them. Right, so now we have the issue with which you were mentioning, Jahanda, where they're not evaluating or measuring the correct things because they don't know the correct things. So kind of think about, in a very structural and systemic way, think about social capital, also monetary capital, how that affects what happens to a young person, whether it be in a classroom or in somebody's organizational group workshop.
I have a small response to it. I'm just going to say I don't believe, even with our black president, that that the system change is going to happen from the top down. I think it happens with people like yourself. You said you're a fellow, right? I believe the way to work on issues of racism is to start where you are. So whatever organization you're in, whatever schools those kids go to that are connected to your organization, go to their school, have a conversation with their principal. Go to their school, have a conversation with that teacher that they say never listens to them or always kicks them out the class. I think that the bigger fight is going to be won with the smaller wars. So that's what I would say.
Can I jump? I'm sorry. Can I jump in one more time? I'm sorry. I'm getting excited now.
I hear you.
And just sort of real examples. So I'm doing some stuff with some work with a school in the city here. It's a charter school. Doing some consulting with them, and it's a middle school, and they have 12 boys on a list to get suspended. Right, 12 boys to be expelled, not suspended, expelled from the school on the list. But the way that they had them in a program in the school, it sort of has a euphemistic title to it to show it's like it's a good program that they're in, but understand that if they don't finish this program, they're all gonna get expelled. 12 kids, all boys. It's 2 girls in this program that are all in expulsion rates on the expulsion on a list. So thinking about that, everything about this, you mentioned the school to prison pipeline. Like when they told me this, that's the first thing that peeked up to me. Like immediately, this is the way we're dealing with 12 people in one school building of about 75 kids, and they're all between the ages of 7 and 8th grade. So I'm thinking about systemically. We think about how charter schools are funded, right? And I'm not going to put too much into the detail about that, but I'm just thinking about how when we think about funding for certain things, how it affects folks on the ground level.
I have another, just miniature on that, just so small. I was just going to say a big thing, and I'm saying this to everybody, a big thing that people can do is if you have kids who are in that kind of situation, expulsion here, anything that has to do with suspension, is to find somebody who is informed to just place their body at the hearing, not even say a word, but just let them know that somebody with intelligence is watching them. I guarantee you it'll be a different result.
Next question.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to ask it. So, developing quality services in the community. Who is responsible? How does it get done? How does it get funded? And I'm going to say Bronx Connect came about because the community said we have a problem with the incarceration of our Black and Hispanic youth. So we really came up from the community, kicking and screaming and fighting. It has not been easy. We're 15 years old this year. But I'm going to go further, and I feel like I'm saying this to you because you're part of Pennsylvania. Hans, maybe one day you'll be part of New York, or the people who kind of make decisions on money. I heard this urbanologist say that they did a study of all this money that went into Chicago's urban renewal, and they realized that 98% of the money actually went to the suburbs because the hospital president and administrator and everybody up to the secretaries lived away from Chicago. And so Chicago's only recipient of that money was the cleaning ladies and the janitors, and they were getting paid $7 an hour, whereas the administrators were getting paid, $250,000. And so they realized that even if it had been a decade of kind of funneling money into Chicago, it was leaving. And so whenever I get anyone of authority to listen, and I try to say, I said this at a Bloomberg meeting, and I didn't get any of his money. I said, we may not have, that's how I said, we may not have a billionaire mayor in 10 years. We have to invest in our communities. We have to make sure that if $10 million gets invested, $5 million of that is employment. A significant chunk needs to go into the very communities that are serving so that we can have employment for our Black men, our Black women, our people of leadership in our communities. So that was my point, is I think should be like, how does it get funded? Well, and what is expected of the funding? Right? Because in the Jewish community, the money stays in the community for 2 weeks. So let's get money that's supposed to support us to stay in our community. That was it.
Wendy, I agree so much because I think what we talk about, and we talked about it today already, were the intersections of all these other systems. And we can't ignore the economic systems that exist and the intersection and how that affects our youth and our families. Because like you said, if there's not employment available, if there's not opportunities available, then we can keep youth out of prison and keep them out of jail to the extent possible. But we're not going to have much for them to do. We're not going to have positive experiences for them to have. They're not going to see people who look like them, who are business owners and who are succeeding highly. So I absolutely agree. That's just one of the intersections that come together to really, lower the opportunities for some youth, and we have to address that.
And I'm going to say something. As the alternative detention program with the lowest rearrest and the lowest failure to appear
I thought you were tied.
in New York City, that was us, right? I love you guys. You came in second.
I thought you were tied. All right, go on.
But that was us. Rearrest is important to us because we're breaking this cycle of a mind that you're going to be rearrested. You don't have to be. We had 7%. City wanted 10%. We beat them. So you can do it.
Okay, one more question.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out today. My name is Rosa, and I'm a forensic social worker at Legal Aid Society and a proud direct practitioner. Okay, no problem. So I work on both delinquency cases as well as child welfare cases. I also work on PINS cases, and I haven't heard anybody talk about PINS cases yet, unless I left the room and someone briefly mentioned them. For anyone who doesn't know, PINS cases are people in need of supervision, youth who are needing supervision. They're petitions filed by parents and legal guardians. I have a lot of concerns as a direct practitioner who works with families who are going through this legal process around the PINS cases. Some of my concerns include the fact that the legal system ends up playing the mediator for family problems that really shouldn't be in family court, despite the family added to court. Also the fact that a lot of the families that I'm seeing are brown and black, low-income families, and I wonder if they were middle-class white families, would they be filing a PINS petition in the first place? And then lastly is that the youth that I work with directly and try and find services for, yes, there is a system in place, the family assessment program, where there are a number of services that you can access, but beyond that, like Exalt, for example, I believe, don't quote me on this, you would know better than I would, but I'm not sure if PINS, you fall into the category of youth that you can serve based on your funding, but don't quote me on that. I know there are a lot of services that exist because of the way the funding is set up, that you have to be involved in a delinquency case, otherwise you're not going to have access to that program, and I have a lot of concern about that because often the PINS youth are pre-delinquency case. So they are very high risk of getting arrested because they already have a PINS case, the police already know who they are, and yet they can't be enrolled in the same services that are so helpful to kids on delinquency petitions.
Quick comments?
Yeah, my quick response was going to be that I think a lot of the PINs are being filed because the lack of information or rather need of resources, and they feel like that's the only way they're going to get access to resources. But they don't know that is probably the worst way to go about it because once you're in the court system, it's very hard to get yourself or your child out of it. We do have kids who have been under PINs. We have service to do, but recently, we definitely have been working with kids who have open cases. So if a kid had a PINS case that was the escalated, and sometimes that can happen, they would be eligible for Exalt. But my short answer was, is basically I agree with you. It's a major issue, and it's more, again, about, like I said, misinformation and trying to keep the culture stagnant by not informing people about what's going on. So to get more information to the hands of those parents before they go and file that PINS, I think would be the best solution at the front end.
Yeah, I agree. Just very quickly that the PINS petitions, by and large, they are almost a con for these parents who in my experience as a former forensic social worker, are just desperately afraid that their child's going to be removed from their care, or they're going to be charged by the Administration for Children's Services with neglect. So it's almost a proactive measure that they feel is a positive thing that can be done for them and their family, particularly if they have younger children and they're trying to avoid that system involvement. Little do they know, as Joanna mentioned, that's just the first step into the system, and that it's very difficult to get out. So I think we educated our parents, and that's our job as social workers and as practitioners, to say, well, there are better ways to address this problem than by inviting the system into your life. And here they are. then we'll get a lot further.
I was going to say, last comment, that a lot of times when we have kids that come in with those situations or where something's escalating within their family, we try to bring in the parent because we try to help avoid any kind of situation where they're going to file anything official that's going to get themselves or their children involved in the system. I was also going to say, I know you mentioned kids, younger kids. I find it a lot with teenagers when parents feel like their teenagers are maybe getting a little out of control, but they don't know what to do. And so they end up going and filing that PINs. And that is a major issue. But I was
Thanks very much. Great panel. And Melissa, you want to come up and do the mechanics? So we're going to do lunch. Melissa's going to explain how. As we eat lunch, we're going to hear from David Brown from the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And I think he told me he brought his checkbook with him. So. Yeah.
Okay, so very briefly, lunch is set up in the room to my right. There are 2 lines. The same food is set up on each line, so please help yourself. We're serving chicken, salmon, and veggie lasagna, and a variety of sides. So please enjoy lunch, and we'll reconvene here promptly.
As soon as everyone's got their food.
All right, wonderful. Enjoy.
Great meeting you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Material. Got to see some interesting exchanges between panelists and speakers. We're going to finish up with some comments from David Brown from the Casey Foundation. So he's currently at the Casey Foundation. I think I first met David, before Casey, you were at the Department of Youth and Rehabilitative Services in D.C., and I think I met you just before you went there, when you were with the Youth Employment Coalition. And David has taught me a lot, actually, about what youth development means in practice, in context. And I always tell him this, but he's the person that reminded me, whenever you're talking about work with young people, especially system-involved young people, if you use the word services too much in isolation, you're off track. You always need to think about services, supports, and opportunities. And I'm sure he didn't make that up. But it's a good way to remind yourself that, yes, there's a role for professionalized services or even paraprofessional services, but you also need activities and supports and the things that BJ started off this morning talking about, which is young people learn from doing things and doing things in a pro-social and positive context, not from sitting and being treated and talked to. Sometimes they need that as well, but to have a holistic approach, you need to always keep that in mind, services, opportunities, and supports. So I think David's going to tell us some about his experiences at Casey now, some about his experiences as he's been working in various settings during his career trying to pursue these goals. And I now turn the podium and the microphone over to David Brown, a native New Yorker, I should say.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Jeff. And also, I appreciate that you did allow people to get their lunches first. That was important. I didn't want to be between folks and their lunch. But thank you, Jeff, for inviting me today. Thank you for the John Jay team. It's a pleasure to be here, and this issue in particular is one I've thought about, struggled with, worked on for almost, I guess, actually 40 years. Going back, and I do have, I was a practitioner. I did run youth programs here in the city back in the 80s. Worked for was then the New York City Youth Bureau back in the late 80s before going to to Washington to work at the National Governors Association and then with the National Youth Employment Coalition and then finally with DYRS. Okay, let me pull this closer. I'm currently a senior associate at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, which is a Baltimore-based foundation. I work within the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group at the foundation. Been there for about 3 years. Casey, though, has been engaged in juvenile justice system reform for over 23 years, most notably the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, which was mentioned earlier, which was launched in 1992 and is currently replicated in over 39 states and over 200 counties across the country, and has contributed to sharp reductions in the juvenile detention population in those jurisdictions. Overall, we've seen a 43% reduction in detention in our JDAI sites. However, in 2011, Casey decided to extend its juvenile justice system reform work to the deep end of the juvenile justice system, pivoting from a focus on reducing confinement for youth in pretrial or awaiting disposition to reducing commitments, confinements, and out-of-home placement post-disposition. This deep end work started in 6 counties and 1 state in 2012. One of the first steps in undertaking this work was to actually work with our jurisdictions to develop a structured decision-making processes to better sort out young people and to ensure that only those who were a true risk to public safety would end up in residential placement, and also to reduce overall penetration within the juvenile justice system. And all our work has an explicit focus on racial disparities and on addressing racial disparities. Of course, as we took on this next step of the work, we realized that once you move to the deep end of the work, we had to start to focus on long-term goals. We couldn't just, JDI was focused on short-term outcomes like failure to appear rates and an arrest while waiting disposition, but with a shift to the deep end, we had to focus on long-term youth well-being, which JDI did not focus on, and it therefore had to start, at that point really started to embrace explicitly the promotion of positive youth development. With this pivot, we realized we had to look at youth well-being and also the transition to adulthood. We also realized that probation practice was not adequate as a way to address these issues. We were concerned that the current array of evidence-based practices were too narrow and did not reflect the full range of services, supports, and opportunities that young people need to become productive citizens. And at that point, we began to fully promote the adoption of programs and practices grounded in the principles of positive youth development. Towards this end, we invited actually Jeff to our annual Deep End site convening to introduce the principles of positive youth development to our local Deep End sites. We convened a series of conversations with probation leaders, service providers, researchers, and others to explore how probation could be changed to promote behavior change and to achieve better youth outcomes. We issued probation transformation grants to 2 local JDI sites to enable them to explore how to incorporate family engagement, positive youth development, and restorative justice into their local probation agencies. We've awarded 3 grants to help build the evidence of promising programs targeting juvenile justice system-involved youth that are grounded in the principles of positive youth development. One of those grants, and this was particularly to recognizing that the current range of evidence-based programs was just too narrow. It didn't reflect the full range of needs of young people. And going beyond what was mostly just the clinical types of supports that are currently make up the array of evidence-based programs in the juvenile justice arena. One of the grantees of those evidence-based practice building grants, evidence building grants was John Jay. And in fact, one of the programs that John Jay is actually looking to build evidence for is the EXALT program where Johanna works. We're also in the process of establishing a youth advisory council to inform and advise our work and to become a model for the field. The council will inform the development of a guide to engaging system-involved youth in system reform work. We actually engage system-involved young people, including Hernan, in the development of the council. In fact, Hernan's participation at our annual JDI conference last April was instrumental in helping us launch this work to make the case as to what the youth voice can bring to these system reform conversations. I'm also pleased to announce that Hernan just actually within the past half hour was told that he was selected as one of the 14 youth selected from a very competitive national pool of young people to serve on our first Youth Advisory Council. So welcome. And I also did want to thank Jeremy, who's from Children's Village, because he was the one who first connected us to Hernan last year. We're also working with 4 Florida historically black colleges on revamping and expanding their juvenile justice courses for their criminal justice majors to reflect the principles of positive youth development, to look at this work through a racial equity lens, and to better prepare the emerging workforce of the juvenile justice system in the state of Florida. We're also funding the development of an in-service training curriculum for Massachusetts frontline juvenile justice staff, both in their probation department and their Department of Youth Services. We're planning a training for all our deep end sites on how to operationalize positive youth justice for both their system and their frontline staff in those jurisdictions. We've also begun to inform how states should begin to consider replacing their current model of youth prisons with a more humane, therapeutic, and developmentally appropriate residential alternative for the small number of youth who may still require out-of-home placement even after we've narrowed the number of kids who actually end up in custody. We've recognized that there are still going to be a small number of kids who are going to need to be in some type of out-of-home placement, but that should not be the kinds of places that we send kids now. Children's Village also has been informing this work. We've already started some of this work in the state of Virginia. We've also engaged some consultants to examine the challenges to introducing positive youth development in public juvenile justice agencies, and to better articulate how to operationalize these principles within a juvenile justice system. So that's some of the work that we've been doing at the Casey Foundation to try to really figure out how we begin to operationalize these very principles within juvenile justice systems and within system reform efforts. But for me, this work, like as mentioned earlier, goes back many years, well beyond my work at Casey Foundation, going back to my years at the Youth Bureau, and here in New York, and even going back to I was thinking about it earlier, an undergraduate report I did, or two reports, one I did on urban delinquency and one I did on middle class delinquency, which for me first emerged what has now become the principles of positive youth development, but then didn't have a name for it. Back then it was just recognizing how youth developments contributed to and the demonization of youth contributed to how youth were labeled as delinquents and were engaged in delinquent behavior, often based on that peer influence that we heard was so important. However, 15 years ago, while I was working as the executive director of the DC-based National Youth Employment Coalition, I was funded by the Casey Foundation to produce a toolkit eventually titled Barriers and Promising Approaches to Workforce and Youth Development for Young Offenders. The toolkit was released in 2002, and it profiled exemplary programmatic and policy initiatives designed to help court-involved youth become economically self-sufficient. One of the co-authors of the report was Vinnie Schiraldi, who was at the time the president of the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice, and was more recently the commissioner of probation here in New York City. The Casey funding that we received was not only used to produce the report, but allowed us to crisscross the country to promote the policy and practices that we highlighted in the report to juvenile justice and workforce development systems. And then in 2005, Vinnie was appointed as the first director of what was then the newly established DC Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services. Soon after being appointed, he brought me on as his deputy director with the explicit instruction to figure out how to operationalize the principles of positive youth development throughout this juvenile correctional agency, and to be the first juvenile justice agency to do so. We were able to implement much of our positive youth development vision until we both left in 2010. This opportunity, I jumped at it because it gave me the chance to really try out the implementation of the very policies and practices that I had been urging other systems to embrace, but didn't necessarily have the experience doing myself. This gave me a chance to actually do what I was telling other folks to do. And it would give me a much greater understanding of the implementation challenges of introducing these concepts within a juvenile justice system. Towards this end, we trained all of the staff, including institutional staff, case managers, administrative staff, maintenance staff, mid and senior level managers in the principles of positive youth development and its adaptability to the juvenile justice system. Going back to the point that you never know if it's that one person who's going to be that caring adult who's going to make that connection. You don't know who it might be a institutional life staff, it may be the maintenance worker or the painter. We've found some of our best youth development workers were our maintenance staff who work with the kids on community service projects and on working on facility improvements. We also de-emphasized the prevalent correctional and mental health or medical models and focused on building skills and expanding opportunities for youth to explore and pursue a range of interests. Although we still maintained our behavioral health staff and provided those services, they did not become the center of our interventions. They were seen as needed for certain kids, but the positive youth development became the center of what we did. We rewrote the job descriptions of our institutional staff to reflect the expectations about positive youth engagement and changed their job titles from youth correctional officers to youth development representatives. We adapted the highly regarded Missouri model for youth corrections, which was that many of you may have heard of, which reflected a much more engaging and positive approach to youth for treating youth who were in institutional facilities. we closed a large, dilapidated, well, this is the, I'm sorry, this is the logo from DYRS, which actually I actually designed the logo. at least inspired it, based on some ideas that I saw somewhere elsewhere. But we actually closed a large, dilapidated, and inhumane prison-like facility, and built. This was the Oak Hill Youth Center, and we built a smaller, state-of-the-art facility with a home-like elements that had an excellent school, but without many of the features commonly associated with a youth prison. We engaged in incarcerated youth in a range of positive activities, including mentoring, Shakespeare theater productions, leadership development, outdoor activities, including we brought kids to whitewater rafting on down the Colorado River, and also they did it down the Potomac. We actually built a rope course on the facility grounds. We engaged kids in community service projects, including this is actually Maya Angelou, who actually came and spoke to the kids on the ground. You see there, obviously this was the old facility with all the barbed wire. We engaged kids in community service efforts. We established a civic justice corps initiative that was and engaged kids in a range of different community service projects. We also engaged a group of kids who went down to Mississippi to actually help rebuild communities that were devastated by Hurricane Katrina. They spent a month in Mississippi helping these are kids who had just come out of our secure facility. Spent a month down there rebuilding homes. We engaged kids in a cultural exchange with the Navajo Nation, where they went down to Arizona. We also had a range of athletic activities. This is the mayor actually recognizing the kids who came back just after they came back from Mississippi from the Gulf Coast Recovery Corps program. Engaged kids in a range of athletic activities, including a triathlon that was run on the grounds of the campus with the mayor. He was a triathlete, and we thought it was a good way to engage the mayor and the kids in some positive activities. We also established developmental domains that reflected positive youth development to guide and inform case planning. We implemented youth family team meetings as their methodology for case planning and case review to enable both youth, families, and other caring adults in their lives to play an active role in the development of their case plans and to ensure that the case plans addressed the positive youth development domains. We recruited and hired and trained youth family team meeting coordinators and facilitators to ensure that youth and families were empowered and enabled to fully participate in those case planning meetings. We established 2 regional networks of community-based providers who were indigenous to the communities where these kids came from to provide a range of services, supports, and opportunities to kids who are placed at home or in the community. And that initiative today is called YouthLink. Within YouthLink, we established a flexible funding pool to support non-traditional needs that weren't necessarily funded through a regular grant initiative, such as a parent might need a bed because a kid's coming home and there's no longer a bed in the house, or to pay for guitar lessons or studio time if they wanted to put down their beats. We established, with the assistance of Jeff Butts, a set of outcome measures for the agency and for service providers that reflect youth development outcomes, including educational attainment, employment, health, relationships, all consistent with the domains that I outlined earlier. We established a range of employment and vocational training programs, including a subsidized employment program with federal funds that we received for both community and youth who were held in the facility. We used federal funds as part of our reentry planning. We used federal funds to enable the school system to hire transition specialists to ensure that committed youth who were in residential care were connected to school immediately upon release and didn't have to wait weeks or months in the community before they were connected to a school program. We partnered with other city agencies to improve access for committed youth to their programs and services. We connected nearly every youth in the community and the facility to a city-subsidized summer job. We implemented regular events to reward positive achievements by the youth in the community and in the facility. So we did that regularly, recognized the kids for what they were doing positively. We opened up the facility to community groups to provide programs and services for the youth in the facility on evenings and weekends. These are all the things that we tried to do to really try to reflect this kind of overall approach to positive youth development. However, this was not without challenges. The schools were often unwilling to accept youth returning to the community, and the alternative schools that they wanted us to send the kids to did not offer the necessary supports to enable their success. Political meddling was a big problem. At one point we had a chair of the authorizing committee who himself was a recovering person who was really pushing us to establish more substance abuse treatment programs and wanted every kid to actually go through some kind of program, even those whose only substance abuse may be moderate marijuana use, but and then diverting resources away from other programs to support his pet program. The correctional staff resisted the change in their job titles. They wanted to be correctional officers. They wanted to wear uniforms and have badges. And they also resisted the new expectations that we put on them, that we want them to positively engage with young people. And they also viewed our approach to coddling of what they considered to be dangerous offenders. The case managers were reluctant to give up their power to make dispositional decisions to the youth family team meeting process. They felt they knew what was best for these kids, and they didn't need to input from the family or their caring adults or parents or other kids who cared about that kid. They knew best what those kids needed. The judges wanted to commit kids to extended periods of time in out-of-home placement. They didn't want us to reduce the number of kids in placement. The demonizing of families and the difficulty of getting our staff to see family as assets and as partners was a big challenge. They resisted the idea that families could be part of the solution. The political, judicial, and media opposition to the idea of reducing our reliance on incarceration was a persistent challenge to all this work. And going along with that, the deficit orientation of most of the system stakeholders. I think Jeff may have been at a meeting that we did where we were trying to introduce positive youth justice to our judges and some of our prosecutors, and just their response to that presentation and their questions they asked showed how far we had to go in having them understand what this meant, because they just only saw kids as problems that had to be fixed, not as assets that could be built upon. Another big challenge is the persistent inertia of institutions, that unless you constantly push against what those facilities become, they eventually overcome any reform efforts. I've already seen that in D.C., that there was just the tendencies of institutions to to promote safety above everything else pushes away from the kinds of programming that we were trying to put in place. And also, we talked earlier about service providers, but we had juvenile justice service providers that wanted to continue to do what they've always done, the same services they'd always provided, and were hostile to our efforts to bring in new providers that reflected a broader range of services, supports, and opportunities. We also had providers, we also wanted to try to get providers outside of our grantees to work with our kids, but often, as you would expect, these providers that were funded to provide services to troubled populations often didn't want to work with the juvenile justice population, particularly the deep end population that we worked with. So, but despite all these challenges, we were able to implement most of our agenda, and many, though not all, of the initiatives have been sustained, built upon, and advanced by the following administration. But most importantly, I think I want to just wrap up and say that my direct work that I did here in New York, working with system-involved youth, also both in Maryland and D.C., what I know for a fact is that when you provide young people with the support, the hope, and you offer a different way, they are able to be positively moved. They are able to change their behavior. They are willing to pursue a different path. And like I said, we said earlier about, I think the comment made that we know that practitioners have been doing many of these things. These aren't new concepts. But it's just a matter of having systems in place that embrace, support, and most importantly, fund these kinds of initiatives. That is the big challenge. Thank you.
Yeah, I sometimes tell the story. My 84-year-old mother occasionally says, "So what are you doing?" And I once told her about the approach we're trying to promote, focusing on positive youth development. She said, "What's that mean?" And I summarized it as, well, instead of just putting kids in professional programs, it's giving them opportunities to do things that are fun, that connect them to their own community, that help them build skills. And she said, "That's new?" And that's always a problem. Any questions or comments to wrap up for David? We have one microphone set up here.
It's not about this, it's about where can we read more about this initiative and everything that Annie did? Is it just on the site, or I want to read up on the initiative with Oak Hill. You know, where can I read more about?
I mean, that was not Casey. That was DYRS.
Okay.
Oak Hill's gone.
Oak Hill was closed. The new facility was the New Beginnings Youth Development Center.
Right, that's
there
what I
was
mean.
a piece that was done on, I think there was a report that some funders, I think including Casey, funded, that kind of looked at, that examined that whole reform effort. I forget what the name of it is, but I can get that for you. But it did kind of chronicle many of the reforms that made up that era that when Vinnie Schiraldi was the director of the agency. And
just what's the ballpark number of cost for that transformation? Can you say that? I'm just curious.
I think that's one of the big challenges. We did have. We were able to. We had a very supportive mayor. We were able to secure federal funding to actually jumpstart the initiative. We got a $3 million grant from the Department of Labor to do the workforce development activities. We had gotten a national group to fund the Civic Justice Corps. We had a lot of partners. We got using federal dollars to expand a lot of the things. The key thing also was we used to send a lot of kids out of state to residential placement. So by bringing those kids back home, we could divert those dollars to community-based alternatives. It's tougher when those dollars are invested in state-run facilities than it is when we're in per diem contracts with individual providers. So that's how we were able to divert resources that way. It was a relatively well-funded agency, and we had a lot of support from the mayor, a lot of support from other agencies because of the mayor's support, and federal dollars that made a lot of this. So the challenge we're having now with the sites that we're working with now don't have those assets. So the challenge is how do you figure out how you get these entities to be able to figure out how to support these kinds of community-based alternatives without the assets that we had. So that's part of what we're doing now with our local deep end sites.
And how many youth were served? Sorry, at New Beginnings. That's how I want to know.
New Beginnings, the New Beginnings had 60 beds. The Oak Hill was like over 180.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Martha Raymond with the Center for the Study of Social Policy. So I have two questions, really. One is to the extent that you were successful with the courts, and because it's not just the judges, right? It's all the players in the courts, the law guardians or the GALs in D.C. or whatever. What strategies did you use on that? And then my other question is, was this initiative in D.C. any way overlap the child welfare reform effort there?
The first question, we never really, while we were there, were successful in engaging the judges. Fortunately, there was an appeals court decision just before Vinnie got there that basically made it clear, stipulated that the judges could only commit a kid to the department. They could not specify how long they were to be held, where they were to go, or any of those kind of conditions. So it gave us a lot of latitude to decide. A kid could be committed one day and we could send them home the next. They couldn't, and we did a lot of that. If kids were judged to be not a risk to the public safety. So even though the judges didn't appreciate it, we didn't need their buy-in to actually pursue a lot of this. We were able to do it without, which is not ideal. And if I was to go, I would have, done it again. I would have tried to get the judges more on board from the beginning, but they were so upset about the fact that they lost that authority, they were resistant to anything we tried to do.
Hans.
So you mentioned you mentioned parent engagement, which I think all of us probably agree that it's a major piece of finding the way to get a parent to be your partner and to buy in to what we're trying to do. But it's often a challenge. I think I mentioned earlier that our youth sometimes lose steam based on their experiences, and our parents have that same issue. So how did you do that? How did you increase parent engagement, parent buy-in with parents who were, I don't know, for want of a better phrase, fed up with their young person?
And we had those issues also. We had, there were a lot of times parents did not want the kids to come home, who they were, who may have really felt that they had enough of them. They were done. But I think ultimately, parents do care about their children and want them to do well. And I think the key was, one of the key things was engaging them in the youth family team meeting process to make it clear. First of all, this is not just a way for you to avoid having to raise your children. We're not going to allow you just to push them out and then forget about them. We're going to try to keep them at home, and we're going to give you supports that you need to be able to support them at home. And that's why they were key partners, that you need to be part of this. We're not going to just send them home without involving you in this process, but what are the supports that you need to be able to enable him or her to be successful? I think that changed the equation for parents, how they saw the system. But I think it's an ongoing challenge, and we're still in the process at Casey of exploring how to actually, how to effectively engage parents in this work and how to make them partners in the development of the young people, and also partners in terms of policy. I mean, it's an area we're exploring now also. It's an emerging area of work for us.
Great, and just one follow-up, and then I'll get the mic up, I promise. Same question, but for staff buy-in. How did you address staff buy-in? Because that's always an issue, kind of a sea change. You went from one way of doing things to another. Could you speak more about that?
And that was a challenge also.
Sure.
The staff are very resistant to this. First of all, they were concerned that our efforts to reduce reliance on incarceration would result in them losing their jobs. So that was their hostile from the very beginning to those concerns, based on those concerns. But one of it was just trying to bring them into the process as much as possible, have them part of the change, as opposed to part of it was working closely with the union. Part of it was, I think at one point some of the staff said to us, we like this positive youth development approach, but why don't you use that same approach with us? Why don't you give us the skills to be successful? Why don't you give us the, recognize that we have to learn? And they, it was a great point that we needed to use that. So part of it was, we invested in them. We invested in all this. We invested in training. We put them through a lot of training. We did recognition events. To recognize employees. We had a youth development award that we gave to employees every year for those that were actually exemplifying the approach. A lot of it was, and there were still folks who never bought in. But in fact, that was a big fight internally, was how much of the staff can be brought on, and how many of them are never going to buy into this. I always felt that there was a much bigger portion of them could be brought on if you could reignite the spark inside of them that first got them into this work. Because they didn't come to this work most of them to be prison guards. Most of them came to this work to make an impact, but then they weren't given the tools to do so. And if you told them we're going to give you the tools to be successful, then they maybe reignite that spark and get them to turn around.
Did you hire any new staff as part of the process?
When we changed the job description, we also changed the educational requirements for the jobs, and we also did try a lot to hire folks who had more educational background, and to bring those folks into the facilities. It was a challenge because as we brought them on, sometimes they were kind of the old staff often still acted like they were prison guards, and it was kind of hard. And sometimes they would either they would join in with the old way, or they realized this isn't what I signed up for, and they would leave. But we did try to hire a lot of new staff. But that's a challenge, though.
Another odd thing that happened there is one of the thorns in their side the whole time was a liberal African-American columnist from the Washington Post who was constantly attacking them. And I've never quite understood his motivation.
Well, yeah, if you were to, yes, because he wrote 35 columns attacking the department. And if you were to read and he was an African-American African-American columnist who, if you were to read, try to draw a conclusion collectively from his columns, he was basically advocating that once a kid was arrested, he should be locked up until he turns 21 years old.
To protect the community.
To protect the community from dangerous kids. And there was one case that really, just kind of to me was just so emblematic of his point of view. We had the Civic Justice Corps program that we'd established. We had kids who had left custody and were working in the community doing community improvement projects, cleaning up rivers, clearing trails in D.C. And a young man who had just been released from custody was in the program, was doing very well. In fact, we had the kids who were shadowing the workers at the construction site for the new facility to learn about the different trades that were involved in building the facility. So we had the kids who were spending half a day shadowing these workers, learning about those trades. This particular kid was doing so well with that the company said, when you finish this program, we'll offer you a job with the company. However, this kid was on his way home from work after he just got paid. It was a Friday evening. He just got paid. He was robbed, shot, and killed. Kobe King's column that week said if he hadn't been released, he would still be alive. I mean, how could you win? Yeah. I mean, he was doing everything right, was at the wrong place at the wrong time, but his response was, see, if you hadn't released him, he'd still be alive today. So that's kind of emblematic of what we were up against.
It's not so easy left and right sometimes. Well, on that sad note, I want to thank David for being here. I think it was a nice way to end up the whole conversation. I guess that's it. Thank you all for coming. And remember, there's the second part, which gets into more nitty-gritty details and teaches practice principles, and hopefully teaches skills among this community to help young people. And that's on April the 14th with Youth Development Institute. Thank you very much.